Conservation Code, the workshops, webinars, so you can see what's coming up in the future. We have several webinars planned for the future. The next one will be commercial envelopes, and then we will be looking at lighting, commercial lighting, and also commercial HVAC. Moving right along. My colleague Ryan found on the CBD website a spreadsheet that has got all the municipalities in Illinois, and 300 of them had listed which codes are in fact in that municipality. So you can see that these are the different years of the IBC in effect in these different municipalities. Some are using the 2000 code, 36 of those municipalities, 59 in 2003. You can see the high is in 2012, 98 municipalities, and then just 7 of the 2018. So it's really kind of a hodgepodge of building codes being used. Makes it difficult for designers and also builders, contractors. And so you can see it's a diverse spread of what year the IBC. There's a link down to the CBD website also at the bottom of this page for your use. It doesn't matter what code you're using, what year of the IBC. The most current version of the Illinois Energy Conservation Code and the Illinois Plumbing Code are both required to be followed by the Illinois statute. So the nice thing about the IECC is it's available online. All the I codes, I think there are like 15 different or 13 or 15 different I codes out there. Everything from the Illinois IBC, the building code, the IRC, mechanical codes, plumbing codes, you name it. They cover fuel code. They cover a lot of different types of codes, and you can get all those online. And there's a link to that. You can see at the top, in blue, to the IECC 2018. So that's very convenient.
So as we look back, looking at the developments of the energy codes and how this has developed over the years, we are continually getting better and better as far as the energy codes, but the majority of that was several large steps that occurred back in 2009 to 2012 area. And so, we have now reached a point at which a building built to code today will use approximately half the energy of one built back in 1975. So over the course of, 40, almost 50 years now, that we have gotten to 50% energy consumption. Now the AIA has set a goal of achieving net zero buildings by 2030, which is just 12 short years away. So we still have a fair bit to go to reach that. In order to reach net zero, while today there are some being constructed, they are definitely more the exception than the rule. Now looking at Illinois and their foray into the energy codes, Illinois started with the Illinois Energy Code back in 2004, as indicated by the green arrow here, with state facilities. They started with themselves before rolling out to the commercial sector in 2007 and the residential in 2010, as shown by the blue arrows. Now, City of Chicago implemented an energy code a little ahead of the state back in 2002 to begin to try to address energy consumption and in particular grid reliability, because if you are stressing the grid out, that can cause some reliability issues. Now, looking at the residential that was adopted in 2010, that was just after a major revision in 2009 and just before another major revision in 2012. Now, since 2012, it has become much more of an incremental improvement and more improving based on usability of the code and kind of fine-tuning things rather than making major changes. So, as Robert mentioned, there are several different I codes by the International Code Council. The IBC and IRC are probably the most recognized and used, but there are several others which could include the mechanical codes, International Fire Code, International Fuel Gas Code, and even the existing building code. And as part of this, the IBC and IRC kind of tie together, where the IRC, as noted here, is for new and existing 1- and 2-family dwellings and smaller townhomes. Anything not covered under that is typically covered by the International Building Code. So once you're outside of the residential, you go to the more general building codes. Something that occurred back in 2015 is the International Code Council rolled the International Energy Conservation Code directly into the IRC, and making that the entirety of Chapter 11 that IECC code. So by adopting the IRC, the IECC will get automatically incorporated. So the IECC is focused purely, specifically on energy and the energy-related systems of a building. The IRC, being a more general code, covers things such as structural, plumbing, mechanical, ventilation, and even moisture control. So, as far as looking at how this breaks down, this is the definition from the IECC as far as what is a residential building. And if you're not in a residential building, then you are considered a commercial building. Now, some of this, they talk about various group types of buildings, and that actually references back to the International Building Code, providing the definitions of the specific occupancies that are group R2, R3, and R4. And that can be found here at the link provided, so you can dig out the specific occupancies and classifications. So there is an Illinois amendment that we'll cover here in a little bit, as far as for Illinois, the Illinois Energy Code as compared to the International Energy Conservation Code. So before we get too far away, there's a couple of different paths, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later as well. But you will find throughout the book terms such as prescriptive and mandatory. Now, the prescriptive path, as it notes here, it's kind of like your shopping list. So you have to check every single box individually. You don't get to substitute one area for another. You have to comply with each and every section. However, throughout the code, there is several provisions that are mandatory, and these are required regardless of which compliance path you take, whether you do prescriptive or a performance-based path. Now, we do have a note here about the ERI. It is not specifically on the current code version. It is the ERI is based on a specific base standard building and your performance relative to that baseline building rather than a current code building. So I noted earlier, Illinois does have its own specific amendment for what is a residential building. Here you see it is very similar in that detached 1- and 2-family dwellings. It also goes into a little bit more specific and assists in some of the classification. Here you note that it is primarily on a permanent basis of residency. So things that are transient occupancy would not be residential. And there is a special provision for municipalities having a population of 1 million people or more. In the state of Illinois, there's only one municipality that qualifies for this, which is the city of Chicago. And there they allow an additional floor of occupancy before switching from residential over to commercial. This is a big change that occurred for the 2018. So as Robert noted earlier, there are several municipalities that have previously enforced the 2012 and even the current 2015 IECC. The definition of approved required testing by the code official or by nationally recognized organizations. Where in the 2018, they made it much more simplified and much easier to use, where it is just deemed to be acceptable to the code official, is then therefore approved. So a little bit more simple and a little more flexibility, particularly as we get into the alterations and renovations later on. This approved, when you're trying to make the code fit together for existing buildings, that flexibility is very useful.
Okay, staying right with in the Chapter 2 definitions of the IECC, we see a slight rewording of air barriers from the 2012 or 2015 IECC. The same intent, but here they mention a continuous manner for the air barrier. You should be able to take a cross-section of your building and draw a continuous line where that air barrier is. So it's nothing new here. It's just a rewording of the definition. Two new definitions in the 2018 IECC that I just wanted to point out: air impermeable insulation and opaque doors. And there is a rewording of the demand recirculation water system. Here they get a little more specific, saying that in the 2018 that they'll pump water from a heated water supply pipe back to the heated water source through a cold water supply line. I think the important thing to realize here is that this is not a continuous recirculation system. It's a demand recirculation system that's triggered by either an occupancy sensor in a bathroom or a switch or a button that you can push to turn on the pump to get the water to start, the hot water to start going back through the cold water lines, so that the whole purpose of this is water conservation. My mother used to have a house where you turn on the hot water in a remote bathroom and you could wait probably at least 3 minutes before hot water would even start showing up. So a lot of wasted water, especially if you have a lot of people in a house. It's for water conservation purposes. But this was really just a rewording in the definitions. In the Illinois specific amendments, and that's something that we should mention that, that you should be aware of, that there's Illinois specific amendments to the IECC that you can get from the CDB website, and they take precedence over the IECC. So we have a local exhaust that was added to the definitions, and the whole house mechanical ventilation system. Just a couple of the underlined portions were added to that definition, which you will see the outdoor air intakes and exhausts have automatic and gravity dampers that close when ventilation is not in operation. That is not only a good idea, but it's also in the mechanical codes. So you see that again. You're all familiar with this, the map of the climate zones. We have 2 in Illinois, the 5A, the cool humid, which are the northern portion of the state, and the 4A, the mixed humid, down the lower portion of the state. Nothing's changed here. Moving to Chapter 3, general requirements, we've got this is new. This was new in the 2015 IECC and remains so. Just an exception to the fenestration product rating. It deals with garage doors and the standards that they need to comply with, and insulated siding also.
So as we talked earlier, there's a couple of different compliance paths that you can take in order to comply with the energy code. Something else I should call out, that these references back to the Capital Development Board's website for the Illinois amendments, along with links back to the ICC for the codes, are also available on the SEDAC's webpage. So if you go to sedac.org, you can gain easy access to those. So if you have some difficulty finding that, that's linked all off of SEDAC's website as well for your use. But for the compliance paths, there are three compliance paths within the code. The first is what we call the prescriptive, which must satisfy all the requirements in sections R 401 through 404, including prescriptive and mandatory requirements. R 405 has a simulated performance option for an energy model, and with that, in addition to the energy model, again, the mandatory requirements in 401 through 404 must still be complied with, even if you're using this path. And finally is the Energy Rating Index, or ERI, compliance path. And so, and again, similarly with that, the mandatory requirements found in 401 through 404 still need to be complied with, even if you're using this. As far as if we've got, for those of you out there interested to find out, do any of you, and you can indicate this by raising your hand, so if you hover towards the bottom of your screen, you will see a little bar pop up that'll allow you to raise your hand. So how many of you have come across projects that have followed this ERI, or formerly the HERS rating system? Okay, so we do have a few, but definitely not a common path. So this is something we'll touch on later, that we may see this show up more going into the future. So here is the actual text from the code books itself, and here again you can see, particularly in the 2015, was when they added the ERI approach and made it such that the ERI can be a compliance path. So we do have a question here regarding trade-offs within the building envelope. I believe the code does have provisions within the prescriptive path that does allow for that. However, you do need to provide the documentation for any such trade-offs you might use. I believe they have a total UA path. But again, that's one that, if you're going to use that, you will need to make sure you provide some documentation for that to the building code official. So one other thing that became available in the 2015 for the building thermal envelope, where the R values and those come through, is if you have a low energy building. So here they divide it as 1 watt per square foot, or 3.4 BTUs per hour per square foot, and this is design capacity. not necessarily what you may need, but the actual design of your installed equipment. And so with that, it's interesting to note that passive house, which is becoming a little more known, and particularly is seeing more inroads on the commercial side, as people find that you can have increased comfort as well as lower energy bills, and typically on with businesses perhaps higher productivity too. But their threshold is 3.2 BTUs per hour. So this low energy building, you're kind of going to think of a passive house type of building for it. And obviously those that do not contain conditioned space are also accepted or excluded from requiring the building thermal envelope compliance. However, that still does require compliance for the other sections, such as lighting and controls. Here in the 2018 version, as you can kind of see, we've just added one new thing to the bottom for the 2018, and that is log homes designed per ICC 400 are not governed under the International Energy Conservation Code. They just use their own for compliance for the building envelope. So, looking at fenestration and insulation requirements, I will call out that this is the table from the 2012 and 2015 IECC, and you can see the table at the top of the slide there that shows there's been a modest change in the U factors for fenestration, going from in the north 0.32 to 0.30, and in the south 0.35 to 0.32. So a modest improvement. Now, most commercial windows today will probably meet this qualification, but you do need to check that. The best windows out there now have U factors of 0.11. So if we do a reciprocal to try to come up with a R value equivalent or an approximation, code compliant window today is about an R3 as compared to the industry leading of R9. So that's quite a dramatic difference between code compliance versus best technology out there, and that also can drive rather substantially towards comfort too. Now, here there were Illinois specific amendments to this table. In the red box, this was an amendment to remove the requirement for solar heat gain coefficient in zone 4, and this has also changed to, this has also, for the 2018, there has been an amendment that is making its way through to remove this amendment and return it back to the 0.4. And similarly with basement walls, that was modified to fit between the zone 5 and zone 4 and copy the zone 4 into zone 5. Now, as far as what that you might be looking at when you're looking for this rating, this is a example of what the NFRC label would look like. And here you can see on this particular window a U factor of 0.3. So that does meet the code requirements, but not to a substantial degree. I mean, it meets it, but just barely. They've changed some language from the 2012 and 2015 up to the 2018 and moved where the additional insulation for heated slabs needs to go. Previously, it was added to the perimeter of the slab. So in this case, it was an R10, but if you had a heated slab, that would be an R15. whereas now I've changed it so that the R5 goes under the entire slab. So you would still have the R10 on the perimeter and then an R10 under the slab. Wood frame walls. In earlier versions, there was a note about structural sheathing that was in the footnote of the table, and this has since been moved to its own subsection R402.2.7, rather than using it just as a footnote within the table. So it makes it a little easier to call it out as its own provision. So for mass walls, this is, again, just a slight tweak on it. And what this is doing is pointing you towards the specific provision R402.2.5 that deals specifically with mass walls, rather than just requiring you to go find it. They provided a little bit of a hint as far as where to go look for this.
Staying in building thermal envelope, introduced in 2015 into the IECC was R402.1.1 vapor retarders. You know, we've been dealing with vapor retarders for a long time, but they just appeared in the IECC in 2015. And what it does is it references sections in the International Residential Code, R702.7. So I wanted to quickly take a look at the International Residential Code. Ryan, this isn't working. Okay. Yes, thank you. The retarder class, you'll see in the next couple of slides, they refer to quite often to class 1, class 2, or class 3 vapor retarders. So class 1 is the sheet polyethylene, class 2 is craft-based fiberglass bats, class 3 latex or enamel paint. So keep that in mind. So class 1 or class 2 vapor retards are required on the interior side of frame walls in climate zone 5. So northern Illinois, you see that these are not required in the southern portion of the state. And class 3 vapor retarders, being the latex or enamel paints, shall be permitted where any one of the conditions in the following table on the slide are met. Vented cladding, or you have continuous insulation on the outside. Ryan and I were talking yesterday and we're wondering, we'd like to take a quick poll. Once again, you can just touch the hand at the bottom of your screen. If you scroll down towards it, it'll appear. How many of you, either the designers or contractors, deal with have seen vented cladding being installed? I have not been out in the field that much here in Champaign, but I do occasionally drive around and look at new construction, and I just haven't seen a lot of that vented cladding being used. I'm just curious how prevalent it is out in the field that any of you see. I think we have one respondent. So it's not real prevalent. That's what I would guess too. You see a lot of it in like Fine Home Building or some of the other magazines, but I just don't see a lot of it out in the field. The ventilated siding, there are minimum clear air spaces, and that's also called out in the IRC. So this is, I just included these to really help you find where to go for some of this information. The IECC building, staying in the thermal envelope. There's some additional text to the R value computation, and that is the blue text at the bottom. It was added in the 2015 version of the IECC, where insulated siding is used for the purpose of complying with the continuous insulation requirements of Table R421.2. The manufacturer's label R value of insulated siding shall be reduced by R.6. And I was talking with Ryan about this yesterday, and Ryan suspected that was due to probably the manufacturers using the air films for their calculations of R values. And that's probably correct. So you have to strip that point or reduce the R value of that insulated siding by 0.6 if you're using for the tables. Building thermal envelope, basement walls. This is an Illinois-specific amendment change, and it's a pretty big change, actually. The walls associated with conditioned basements shall be insulated from the top of the basement wall down to 4 feet below grade. In the IECC, that reads to 10 feet or the floor of the basement. So that's quite a big change from the IECC. Building thermal envelope, air leakage. This is mandatory. This was starting in 2012. It was made mandatory. The Illinois amended the requirement to ACH 50 less than or equal to 5 for 2015. It was, I'm sorry. Let Ryan talk about this. He's more versed on this than I am.
So when air leakage was brought into the code, it previously had been an air changes ACH 50 of 7, and then one of the reasons why there was that big step in performance of the energy codes was in 2012, the air leakage for the model code was dropped from 7 down to 3. And so Illinois was concerned about construction being able to keep up and actually meet that requirement. As previously, testing and verification of air leakage had not been previously done on a broad, on a routine basis. And so Illinois stepped, instead of from 7 to 3, they stepped it from 7 down to 5 for the 2015. There's a 2018 amendment that is anticipated to drop this down to 4, pending Joint Committee on Administrative Rules approval of that. And the forward look from the subcommittee was to perhaps remove the amendment entirely for 2021, which would bring the state in line with the code of 3. So allowing builders time to learn and improve their techniques over time, moving from 5 to 4 and finally to 3. And also allowing some technology to catch up too. Similarly, testing was brought in to the 2015. Illinois had made an amendment such that, in the event that the air changes are 5 air changes or less, which is the Illinois maximum, the building shall be ventilated in accordance with the section 403.6. Now, there was an exception also added for renovations, alterations, and repairs. Obviously, it is not uncommon where you're adding on to a 1960s or 1800s building, which was not designed to be airtight. And so the provisions noting that we're not going to necessarily test those buildings, but we do want to make sure that the barriers and insulation were installed and installed properly, even if we don't actually do the testing. Notice here for 2018, they have proposed removing the entire first sentence anyways, because in order to meet the energy code, you will have a tight building, And so therefore just striking the sentence and just beginning with the building shall be provided with the whole house mechanical ventilation system. So again, some of this is simplifying the text over time. So Illinois also covers specifically for heated private garages that comes up. And so with that, heated garages do need to be isolated from, thermally isolated from the other habitable conditioned spaces. And so with that, while thermally isolating the garage from the rest of the home is important, air barriers are very crucial to prevent any pollutants from the garage from entering the home. But noting here that the envelope tightness for a garage is not necessarily, does not have to be tested. So for rooms with open combustion for air from outside, Illinois, the International Energy Conservation Code had basically required rooms to be weatherized from the conditioned space. Illinois has amended this provision out for the 2015 and also is proposed to stay out for the 2018 as well. But the alternative to building these specialized rooms for water heaters and furnaces with open combustion is to use sealed combustion appliances. So as far as the systems for hot water boilers, the code now starting with 2015 and continues through the current code is boiler reset for outdoor temperature, requiring that. There is a provision if you have an instantaneous hot water system that's driven off that boiler, then you don't have to do the temperature setback. But this does help with boiler efficiency too. Duct insulation, larger ducts have increased the insulation levels and given a modest decrease for small ducts. Again, looking at larger ducts are likely to move more conditioning, and so we want to make sure that we don't lose that along the way. For heated circulation, this kind of ties back to the demand hot water system earlier, but also includes other types beyond just the demand recirculation systems. Also covers heat trace systems, and again, looking at how do we make this such that it's functional but not costly from an energy standpoint. For 2018, they've added some language regarding ducts that are buried within the ceiling insulation and how to treat them. And as part of that, adding some additional guidance as far as what constitutes, are they buried in the ceiling insulation? At what point are they considered buried versus not buried? So here noting that, the insulation not less than R19, in excluding the value of the duct insulation. So it has to be under at least an R19 of insulation before it becomes qualified as buried. So as far as determining whether they're in, ducts are in the conditioned space or not, this is something else for energy models and things like that that are very critical to determine, are you in the conditioned space or not? And so here's the provisions that they provide. Obviously, if all the ductwork is completely inside the air barrier, then you are in the conditioned space. But if you are outside the air barrier, but you are buried, you do qualify as you are buried in the ceiling insulation, and Your air handler is inside the air and thermal barriers. You have low leakage ducts, and you have a full depth of insulation above that duct. So that could be, an R49 that you have to have completely above the duct before you have it. And here's kind of a little bit of a picture of the ducts being buried in that insulation. So the ducts would typically be running along the bottom or along the top of the ceiling, if you will. We've also added provisions as far as fan efficiency for heat recovery ventilation and energy recovery ventilation. And if we think about this, when you have a piece of equipment that is likely to operate, nearly continuous, if not continuously, having efficient equipment really can make a big impact on that. So they have called out in the code as far as what that efficiency needs to be for those.
Ryan was talking about ventilation, and you can see here the Illinois amendments to the IECC. They're quite extensive. We decided not to include all the text under these from R 403 6.2 through R 403 6.7. They all have to do with ventilation, and they are in the IRCC in Chapter 15. So this is something to be aware of. This is an important slide, really. So as Ryan said, you can get to those Illinois amendments on the CBD website, and you can get to that website very easily from the SEDAC website. So this is something to be aware of. There is also the reduced requirement for pipe insulation from 2015 from the 2012 IECC. And also pools, this is mandatory as far as pool covers. If you have over 75% of your energy coming from, say, a solar system, a solar thermal system, you don't need a pool cover, but or some type of energy recovery system. But if you are using say a gas-fired pool heater or something of that nature, you do need, it's mandatory to have pool covers. Electrical power and lighting system. Here they have increased the lamp requirements from 75 to 90% of the permanently installed lighting fixtures, and they eliminated the exemption for low voltage lighting. So the first question somebody would probably ask is, well, what's a high efficacy lamp? Well, going back to the definitions, high efficacy lamps, they're compact fluorescence, LEDs, T8s or smaller diameter linear fluorescence, or a lamp with an efficacy of not less than the following. And this is an Illinois amendment to what is in the IECC, and that's 65 lumens per watt for fixtures and 55 lumens per watt for lamps, excuse me, and 55 lumens per watt for fixtures. The IECC simulated performance alternative. This mechanical ventilation was added in the 2018 version of the IECC. It's for, if you're going to be doing modeling, you have to account for all that mechanical ventilation too. Batch sampling is allowed in your models, so it makes modeling of multi-story buildings much easier. And the ERI compliance alternative, the section 406 was added to the IECC in 2015, as Ryan mentioned before. There are mandatory requirements that you have to meet even in the energy rating index. And It's the energy rating index is determined in accordance with the ResNet IECC 301, and we have a link to that standard down below. You can see the maximum energy rating index has increased from 2015 to 2018. Meaning it's easier to comply with this. You can see in climate zone Northern Illinois, it's gone from 55 to 61, and in Southern Illinois from 54 to 62. So they've relaxed the ERI score, so they're hoping that more people will possibly use this alternative compliance route.
So as we get into existing buildings, since most of our stock today and in the future will be existing stocks, Chapter 5 was added to address how do we deal with our existing buildings when we go to make renovations and repairs to it. So for additions and alterations, and this is where we get several questions, is how to comply with this. And the IECC provides some guidance noting that unaltered portions of the existing building are not required to comply with the code. So even when you do make some upgrades and say, okay, I'm going to go ahead and do a lighting upgrade, it's not requiring me to do anything about the thermal envelope or the HVAC systems while at that time. So for additions, this was a specific amendment for Illinois. When you're adding on to existing ducts, that you're not going to do the testing of the ductwork. However, sealing is required of the ductwork, even if you don't go through to do the testing of it, to verify that the old leaky ductwork is not compliant with the new airtightness standards. This is one, roofs tend to be a common issue, particularly with flat roofs when you go to redo that with insulation, and oftentimes you'll see the heating and air equipment sitting on the roof. And so for these flat roofs, they do have a provision such that you want to insulate the roof to the best of your ability, even if you can't reach the full insulation value required by the code. And this has been something that the code officials we've talked to, they've kind of been in agreement that the goal is you want to do the best you can with the conditions you've been provided. Not that you're going to pick up the heating and air unit in order to accommodate that extra insulation. And here for tapered insulation, there is some additional allowance within the residential for new stuff. As far as the average R value of an R20 for this tapered insulation for Illinois. Here, this is very similar to the previous one for renovations. This is now for alterations. Again, sealing the ductwork, but not necessarily testing the old ductwork. Now, as far as repairs for Illinois, adding some insulation with a new roof covering over the existing roof covering without removing it for these flat roofs or low slope roofs of 2 and 12 or less. And you use tapered insulation to create the pitch, that is considered a repair and not a renovation or alteration. So again, you would not have removed the roof membrane for this. So We have a couple of questions coming in here, so if you do have questions, feel free to either type them in the question and answer box, or if you do have questions at another time, feel free to email us at energycode@sedac.org. So here we have a question regarding residential alterations. So when you open and expose the insulation, you have exposed the wall cavity. There is a provision in the code requiring that you fill the cavity. You are welcome to exceed the code at any point, but if you have if the code calls out for you need to meet an R20 in the walls, that's typically done using 2x6 framing. But when you open a cavity and you have 2x4 construction, that's going to be difficult to reach the R20, but you may be able to get an R13 or an R15 in that cavity. It's just that they want you to fill the cavity without necessarily changing the structure, because that's going to be the cheapest insulation you're going to be able to implement at that point. Again, you've opened it, you've exposed it. Making a repair is not terribly costly at that point. Now, if you had to fur it out to bring it out to a 2x6, that would get very costly. So, and the only time that you would necessarily have to fill the cavity is in the event that you are not able to reach the code required amount of insulation. So if you open a wall and you are able to fit you're able to fit an R20 insulation in that wall, then you're done, no matter how thick or thin that is. So you don't necessarily have to fill it as long as you've achieved the code required amount.
We're reading through a long question here, so please give us a moment.
All right, answering back to Joe as far as looking at running some of the prescriptive assemblies through some modeling programs. We have not done that specific case that you've talked about, but that would be an interesting thing for us to do, and so we'll take that back and look through that. That is definitely something that it's not uncommon where we will get a question where people are looking at, well, how much cavity insulation can I add such that I don't have to put continuous insulation for a new building? And another way to direct that is to say, well, you could go that direction or the other direction, in which you look to see how much continuous insulation it would take to meet the requirements, such that you require no cavity insulation, and leave the cavity open for plumbing, electrical, not to mention if all your insulation's on the outside of the cavity, you're not likely to get freezing pipes and burst pipes. But we'll definitely take a look at this further. Here's a question regarding changing in use. Particularly the code is looking at it when you have a change in use, which is the R505 use, and noting that when you're changing the occupancy, that either would result in an increased demand for fossil fuels or electricity, then that change, then the code would come into play for that. And in particular, any space that is converted to a dwelling unit or portion thereof from another use or occupancy. It's not uncommon for us to see this where a former garage is wanted to turn into a living room or bedroom. Then code compliance would come into play, and that space would have to be brought up to meet the current energy code. Now, there is an exception that allows you up to 110% of the energy cost allowed using the energy model. And what that is for is, while you may not have built the space to meet the existing code, did you build it such that it was near the energy code, such that you don't have to go back and make a lot of changes to it? So they do give you that 110%, or that 10% extra allowance for that, where you were close to meeting code, but just not quite. So, this could be a space where it may have originally been built to the 2012 code, but it was not an occupied space at that time, and so then you move in the 2018 code. So it was not built to the current code, but it is likely in that case, in the example, between the 2012 and 2018, you would meet that 110% threshold. So, well, we are at 1 o'clock now, so I do want to thank everyone for participating in today's webinar. If you do have any questions, again, feel free to reach out to us, energycode@sedac.org, or if you, and there again, we are here to provide technical assistance for the whole state. So whether that is, builders, code officials, building owners, we are here to help and provide technical assistance on the code for everyone. So with that, we'll wrap it up today, and everyone have a great afternoon. Thank you very much for joining us.